Good morning. It's 9:30 and it's time to resume this hearing session. We're going to continue our discussion on matter 3, issue 2. I'm G.J. Fort. I'm the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct this examination and report to the council in due course. So before we continue, if I could ask the representatives of the council to introduce themselves, please.
Good morning, sir. Wayne Beglan, counsel for the council, and I have with me this morning Mr. Longley and Mrs. Nash.
Thank you. And other participants in the room, please.
It's all right, sorry, halfway through, you'll pass on. Lucy Morris, Nexus Planning on behalf of Kingacre Estates.
Good morning, sir. Michael Wood, WSP on behalf of Ptarmigan Land.
And those joining us on Zoom, please.
Good morning, sir. Estelle Dehaan, QC of Council on behalf of Ashhill Land.
Chris Roberts, Boyer Planning on behalf of Ashhill Land as well.
Thank you. And just before we start the discussion, if I could ask Programme Officer Charlotte Glancy to remind us of the housekeeping matters, please.
Morning, everyone. This is what to do in the event of a fire. If in the unlikely event of a fire or other serious incident, the alarm in this building is a siren. If alarms are inoperative or inadvisable in a bomb emergency, the instructions to leave will be given by word of mouth. If the alarm sounds, leave by the nearest safe fire exit. Please note the position of fire exits from this room. Do not stop to reclaim personal effects. Do not use the lift. Proceed to the assembly point. This is located during the daytime until 6:30 in the evening at the far end of the Berries playing field opposite the council offices. And after 6:30 in the evening, it's at Waitrose car park, and remain at the evacuation point until instructed that it is safe to re-enter the building. And if people would like to know where the toilets are, they are just out of this room on the right hand, going through a corridor on the right hand side, and then they're on the right hand side. Thank you.
Thank you. So we now move on to the issue of whether the LPP2's policies, insofar as they relate to management of development in the Greenbelt, are consistent with national policy, justified and effective. So I'd like to start this discussion on policy DM14, insofar as it relates to extensions and alterations to buildings. So a number of main modifications have been proposed to this policy and its supporting text. So could the council please take me through these and the rationale for them?
Thank you, sir. Yes, as a result of your questions, we have reviewed carefully the policies that insofar as development management in the Greenbelt are concerned, and we've suggested a number of changes because we do feel that there is some inconsistency with the MPPF, and we really need to clarify the application of those policies. To set the context, it's important to recognise that policy DM14 effectively brings together 4 policies from the previous 2002 plan relating to control of development within rural settlements, extensions, replacement dwellings, garages and ancillary buildings. And so it's trying to do quite a job of condensing that. And I think in some cases it perhaps leaves a lack of clarity that hopefully our main modifications help to address. I think possibly that some of the supporting text as well in the plan as submitted is clearly written from a development management experience point of view, and to that extent it might perhaps be been overly positive and trying to be too helpful in its wording around what the exceptions to the policy may be. So if you felt there was a need to sort of clarify that and to reduce the text, we'd be very happy to look back at that. So I will talk you through the main modifications as you've requested, but I'd also draw your attention to a sheet that we've provided you with this morning, and we've got copies that other participants in the room can have, and that relates to the issue of fully subterranean structures and how we address those in the policy, and I'll come to that in due course because we think some clarification is appropriate around that. This is quite a well-used policy in development management, and you can imagine that as you'd imagine, the individual words are very carefully scrutinised in the application and the appeals process. And it's evolved from an approach taken by the County Council in the 1960s around controller development. And I'll come on to that because that's why we cast back to 1968 when the policy around extension of dwellings was introduced. And that's clearly a departure from the 1948 baseline in the MPPF. So would it help if I just sort of go through the point by point? The first main modification that we introduce is MM 54, where I think there was paragraph 3.13 stated that the policy related to residential applications. Well, clearly it's got a broader application from that. So we're proposing in paragraph 3.13 that we simply strike out the word residential in the final line, and also to just simply tidying up in terms of the tense of that sentence. We say not that it's proposed, but that it sets out in greater detail how applications in the Greenbelt will be assessed. So that's really just tidying up the text. The second main modification we're proposing, MM 59, is the point that I've mentioned about the base state for looking at incremental extensions to residential properties in the Greenbelt. And we've explained in our response statement why Waverley has used 1968 rather than the MPPF 1948 definition of original dwelling. It would be possible, sir, if you felt it necessary to change that to be in line with the MPPF, but we feel that would have unintended consequences in that not only would it create an additional burden in terms of development management looking back for a further 20 years, but it would also effectively move the goalposts on the application of that policy as it's been applied locally and is understood locally to work from 1968. So we would like to retain 1968 for residential dwellings, but in line with the MPPF, the original dwellings in other cases would relate back to the 1948 definition. So that's recommended modification that we're putting for your consideration, MM 59.
Just a bit further on that, Mr. Longley, in terms of, so there's effectively two base dates, isn't there? If that modification is taken forward, there's the kind of Surrey structure plan base date from the 1968. That'd be for dwellings. But any other building, it'd have the 1948.
That would, yes, that would be the implications of that, and that's purely because it has been residential development that the policy has applied the 1968 definition to, and it would be appropriate, we feel, for the MPPF definition to be used otherwise.
So can I just add very briefly on that point? One of the cases that we'll be looking at tomorrow is the Oxted residential case that you've highlighted. One of the things, as it turns out, that that case also discusses are these kinds of uses of local departures on Greenbelt policy, and in particular, because Tangents is a Surrey authority, that the use of these dates. And so, sir, just for your note, that's dealt with under issue 5 of the judgment. Paragraph 41 sets out the Surrey base date of the 31st of December 1968, and then there's a later discussion of that issue. The main part is really paragraphs 46, which contains quite a long quote, but then 46 through to 49. And so if you wanted some comfort that this approach has been adopted elsewhere as one reasonable approach and been accepted on that basis, then you can find it in those paragraphs. And the other more general observation it perhaps makes is the ability for local planning authorities, where it's appropriate to do so, to depart from national policy due to local circumstances, practice and procedure. And this is perhaps an example of one of those cases where actually consistency of process over points of time could be quite important to those who have to apply this guidance, and indeed to people who have purchased houses and sought to or are seeking to make changes to them. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, please continue, Mr.
Okay,
Long.
thank you, sir. So the next proposed main modification is MM55, and this results from your questioning of the phrase "will be permitted" in policy DM14, and we've reflected on that, and clearly national policy is very much around allowing development that is not inappropriate, the double negative. So the national policy really comes from a position of restraint within the green belt. And I think the way that policy DM14 introduces itself is positively prepared, and clearly that was the way the council was trying to draft policies. But in the Greenbelt instance, it might be safer to revert to the MPPF wording and just make it clear that extensions and alterations to buildings should not be disproportionate to the original building, and replacement dwellings should be the same use and should not be materially larger than the existing building. So it replicates national policy, and you may say, well, why is that necessary? But I think if the policy introduces a more positive tone, it's possibly introducing a loophole. So that one, sir, is really for your guidance as to whether that's a necessary main modification. But we think it would be a helpful clarification. The next point we deal with is main modification 56, and this is a fairly small point, but it does relate to the next one I'll talk about, which are modifications 80 and 81, which are talking about subterranean structures and basements, because as drafted, the policy just talks about extensions, which would increase the floor space, whereas the MPPF talks about extensions or alterations, and clearly it's capable of increasing floor space without physically extending a building. And I'm sure there's lots of room for legal debate around how basements fit into that, but we're suggesting we simply add in extensions or alterations. So that's in criterion B of the policy. And so for noting, sir, those guidance percentage figures were in the 2002 plan, they were in the supporting text. And they've clearly been brought into the policy itself to give them a bit more weight, a bit more bite in terms of development management. And we can say something further about those percentages if it helps. So the further change that I've put in front of the examination is the sheet which has main modifications 81 and 82, which picks up this issue of subterranean floor space, which paragraph 3.19 of the plan as drafted implies that that won't be taken into account in terms of assessing the impacts of extensions or alterations to dwellings. But clearly the planning practice guidance does recognise that the level of activity, traffic, etc., arising from the development can have an impact on the openness of the green belt, and is therefore appropriately dealt with in the policy. So for clarification, the suggestion is that we should strike out paragraph 3.19 altogether, but to capture the sentiment, because Waverley has taken a sympathetic position in its plans and decisions where householders are creating additional floor space within the volume of the existing building. And I think from the text within basements where that doesn't extend beyond the footprint of the building. So we're proposing that that sentiment is added in MM 81, that's added into paragraph 3.16, which would read developments which exceed these guidelines, that's the 40% guideline, may be acceptable where the floor space created is created within the volume of the existing building, such as conversions of lofts or cellars. So that's maintaining that message, but without providing a loophole which could be used to justify subterranean dwellings or very large basement additions. So we hope that that addresses the matter of consistency that I think you were drawing our attention to.
Thank you, Mr. Longley. So in terms of the MM 81, developments which exceed these guidelines may be acceptable. In some circumstances is struck out. And then replaced with where floor space is created within the volume of the existing building, such as the conversion of lofts or cellars. So is that the only circumstance that's anticipated? It goes from quite and I heard what you said in opening your remarks on this, but it goes from a sort of broad, potentially broader interpretation there to something that's narrower. Is that what's intended, and is that justified?
So I think that is a good point, and it could be overcome if we just said such as or including and reference to that. So that wouldn't limit the flexibility for the council to do so.
And in terms of those kinds of floor space increases, they may involve alterations, a proposal. I'm thinking perhaps small dormers, or that require planning permission, or basement areas to have light, natural light in. So would it be clear that those kinds of even though that kind of support comes through that main modification there, would it be clear that any of any alterations would be subject to the policy in DM 14.
I don't think that's the modification takes away from that, particularly if we do introduce reintroduce that flexibility. But what we're no longer doing is effectively in 3.19 spelling out what could be a big loophole in the policy of constraints within the Greenbelt.
Okay, and the question 7 I posed on domestic garages and ancillary outbuildings. So in those terms, I was thinking about instances where those buildings might need planning permission, but would nevertheless be replacement buildings per 149D of the framework. So that talks about buildings that aren't materially larger than what they replace, but you know, they could, given that definition, they might require planning permission. So is that potentially what the plan's saying about those types of buildings? Is it potentially a trifle more restrictive than what the framework says in 149?
I don't think that the intention is to be more restrictive than the NPPF, and if we can clarify that through a bit of additional wording, we can do so. The policy that this was replacing was policy RD3 of the 2002 plan, which might give us some words that we could introduce to really clarify how those proposals are to be addressed. But the intention is to be entirely consistent with the NPPF in this respect.
So if I could ask you to look at what the plan says about those types of buildings, particularly against 149D. This main modification, the proposed main modification 57 relates to limited infilling. So Mr. Longley, would you be able to tell us something about the rationale for that, please?
Yes, and this is a main modification that we've been talking about and pondering how we best address the issue that I think you were drawing to our attention, that the NPPF only refers to limited infilling within villages, and are we right in trying to define what we mean by limited infilling as being infilling within a gap or row of development as set out in criterion C. In response to your question, we suggested that we might reintroduce some wording from the previous policy, which further categorized limited infilling as as being infilling of sites that are substantially surrounded by existing buildings. The reason that I think we just need to ponder that a bit more and would welcome your guidance is that the previous plan washed over, I think, most of the villages, if not all of the villages within the Greenbelt, whereas the plan before you takes out insets the larger villages, which will naturally have the greater opportunities for infilling, which is more substantial than just the odd dwelling in a substantially built up frontage. So I think what we may wish to do, or what you may wish to look at, is whether we make it clear, be consistent with the NPPF in terms of limited infilling within villages. But to then caveat that, and we've got wording from the previous plan along the lines that it doesn't impact on the openness of the settlement and the character of the settlement, including the low density fringes where some of these villages bleed out into open countryside. And that's what the previous plan does. And I think in condensing that into criterion C, we might have lost a bit of that more nuanced guidance relating to the smaller villages within Waverley Borough. So if that's something that you would like us to look at a bit further, we can come back to you with some additional wording in relation to that.
I think my initial concern on bringing openness into a consideration of limited infilling is in terms of the framework where it talks about the list of not inappropriate types of development. 149E is limited infilling in villages, and unlike some of the other types of not inappropriate development, so if we look at 149G, so that talks about limited infilling or partial or complete redevelopment of previously developed land, whether redundant or in continuing use, etc., which would not have a greater impact on the openness of the greenbelt than the existing development. So that's the kind of openness consideration is implicit there in whether it's not inappropriate. Whereas with limited infilling, that kind of assessment isn't explicitly set out in 149E. So I think in introducing a local policy that perhaps adds that layer on, I'd need to be persuaded that it was consistent with the framework in terms of what the framework is saying about that type of not inappropriate development.
Yes, so I understand the point you're making. I suppose I was reverting back to paragraph 144 of the framework, which talks about the rationale for washing over some villages, and that's primarily because of the important contribution which the open character of the village makes to the openness of the greenbelt, and that's the reason for including it within the greenbelt. So the rationale is that a policy allowing for some development within that village should nevertheless protect the open character of the village. And as I say, that applies particularly on the fringes of some of these smaller settlements.
Well, I think it'd be useful to have some further thoughts on that. So if you could revisit the modification with those sort of broad principles in mind, and then we'll come back to have a look at that as the examination progresses. But it's useful to have that marker at this point. Mr. Chapman, you had some views on limited infilling.
Yes, sir, I did. Thank you. Firstly, apologies for my late arrival this morning. I'm so sorry about that. Yes, I mean, with regard to criterion C of DM14, where we have villages, settlements that have been identified within the local plan part 1 as being suitable for further or suitable for the focus of development. I think that there does appear to be some conflict with regard to, on the one hand, we're looking at making alterations to the settlement boundaries, and I take what was said yesterday at the close of the session with regard to why some of the settlement boundaries have been altered. But if we're looking at the more sustainable villages being acceptable for further development, but we are limiting the criteria for how development can be accommodated within those villages, it almost seems like the settlement boundaries are sort of superfluous to a degree. If we're looking at the character of a village as opposed to a settlement where development could be located, I'm wondering the logic of the redrawing of the settlement boundaries.
Any response to that? Given that there's a difference, isn't there, between a settlement boundary being a planning designation and a village not having a planning definition, but being a classic sort of fact and degree sort of thing. You got any responses to that?
Yes, the approach in the plan under examination is to inset those villages within the green belt that are larger and are of a more built up form, where there is an expectation that there will be more opportunities for development, and those will be considered through the other policies of the plan. And then those villages which are washed over by the green belt and in line with green belt policy, with national green belt policy, there ought to be restraint over development other than development which is not inappropriate, which national policy defines as limited infilling. And so the last bit of discussion was around how we define what that limited infilling should include, and the previous plans provide some indication of possible wording for that. So I think it's important to recognise that settlement boundaries are important to the plan in providing clarity around what's within a settlement, what's outside a settlement, and which policies ought to apply. But the policy we're talking about now is the policies that apply to those settlements that are washed over by the green belt, and where there ought to be restraint in line with national policy.
Mr. Chapman.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. But for that, I'm thinking though, but the point that I'm really making, and I know we're going to keep on going back to housing land supply. That the point really I'm looking to make is that the borough the borough can't demonstrate suitable housing land supply. The local plan part 1 talks about the villages where the focus of development should be. However, the policy, how we're progressing, isn't allowing for further development to take place within these villages. That's really the point I'm looking to make. On the one hand, they're saying this is suitable for development, but now we're facing constraints within this settlement boundary. As I say, I don't really see the logic of redrawing settlement boundaries if it isn't going to be able to help development coming forward.
But any views on that distinction between the villages that are inset from the green belt boundary and those that continue to be washed over by the green belt?
Well, I think going back to policy RD1 of the 2002 local plan, it talks about within the settlement area, the characteristics therein whereby further development could be acceptable. And with policy RD1, there is a clearer distinction between development taking place within settlements and development taking place within villages. So I almost feel that what we're looking to do here is almost take a step backwards in looking to put a more restrictive constraint on the circumstances in which development can come forward. And again, sorry, I'm banging the same drum, but also at a time whereby the borough is facing issues with regard to meeting its housing land supply.
Thank you, Mr. Chapman. Any final responses on this matter, please, Mr. Longley?
Only that it's an explicit part of the strategy that there are villages which are inset, which are the larger ones, the more built up character ones that would be expected to have development opportunities arising, and those that are more sensitive, where they are an important part of the open character of the green belt and therefore are washed over. So there is a very clear distinction there. There are policies in the plan. I think to the extent that it relates to the policy in question today, I think your point relates to what is limited infilling and how can that be defined. But there is a rural exceptions policy in local plan part 1, which obviously allows for small additions to villages justified by local housing needs. So the council isn't looking to set these villages in aspic. It's recognised that places will continue to accommodate development, but it will be within the greenbelt villages. It will be limited and largely limited to infilling that doesn't impact on that character and openness.
Thank you. So I'm moving on now to openness, that concept. So I posed some questions on this in the MIQs, and the main modification 58 has been proposed. So could you talk me through that, please?
Yeah. Yes. So I think this modification is important in that it introduces the factors set out in plan and practice guidance, which are not just limited to the scale, mass, height and volume of the building, which is obviously one of the most important impacts, but it does pick up on the degree of activity likely to be generated, including traffic, and the duration of development and its remediability. And those are words straight from the plan and practice guidance. But I think that does support the approach to alterations and subterranean structures. It's about the amount of development, even if it's not seen, taking place within the green belt, and the impact that will have on the open character and appearance of the green belt. So we're recommending that we introduce those changes, notwithstanding that it is set out in plan and practice guidance, and so the council could, if it wished, rely on that. But I think it does help give clarity to the plan to explain that those factors will also be taken into account.
Okay, thank you. So that concludes the questions I had on issue 2. Is there anything else on Greenbelt before me Mr. Chapman.
Thank you, sir. And again, I apologise for coming in late this morning. It's maybe something that you've covered already. I just wanted to quickly bring up the matter of the relationship between extensions and alterations to dwellings in the Greenbelt and replacement dwellings. At the moment, the 2002 local plan and the 2010 residential extensions guidance that we have from the council, it's quite clear that the principle of replacing a dwelling in the Greenbelt and subsequently extending it is acceptable. I don't think that comes across as strongly with this local plan, but you know, that has been an accepted policy stance for many years. So I don't know whether the council is intending to produce a subsequent guidance document that would make that clear, or whether that ought to be in the supporting text to policy DM14 somewhere. But I'd just like to raise that matter. The other matter as well. Actually, no. So I'll leave that for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of that issue and thinking about paragraphs, supporting text in paragraphs 3.23, 3.24, where it talks about sort of situations similar to those that Mr. Chapman has described. Is the plan sort of adequately, is it clear and effective in those terms? And indeed, what I think, particularly with paragraph 3.23, what types of activity is that talking about that says this approach will not comply with policy DM14? So just taking into account Mr. Chapman's points and just my observations on those two paragraphs, please.
Yes, well, the plan is quite clear that a proposal is either one or the other. It's either a replacement dwelling, in which case the council has accepted up to a 10% addition as being not materially larger, or it's an extension to an existing property, in which case, bearing in mind that this is a cumulative issue about how properties have changed since 1968, it gives more leeway, and that's the 40% figure, which, as I said previously, were initially supporting text in the 2002 plan, but the council wants to give that more weight by putting it into the policy. What 3.23 and 3.24 are saying is that the argument that Mr. Chapman's introduced is clearly played out through the development management process, where somebody sees a property in the Greenbelt, seeks to redevelop it, not just at 10%, but to take the 40% extension as well, and come up with a 50% larger dwelling, or figures to that in that respect. So what 3.23 is saying is that, you know, that's the pressure. The council doesn't see that as complying with DM14, which, as I say, you're either one thing or the other. You can't take both. But elsewhere, we talked about that previous change where there may be circumstances where a larger extension, larger addition is appropriate in 3.16. That would allow, you know, those circumstances to be explored. And 3.24 does allude to where that's clearly been an argument that's been accepted in the past, is that where the existing property that's been extended is just structurally not up to standards, and it would be preferable to rebuild it. So that's an instance where the council has accepted that argument. But as a general principle, no, the redevelopment, the complete rebuild, the 10% would apply unless there are extenuating circumstances which would be dealt with on a case-by-case basis.
Mr. Chapman.
Okay, thank you. So just to be quite clear, it's a complete shift in terms of policy that we're coming with policy DM14. We're moving completely away from policy RD2, RD2A, and the guidance in the residential extensions document, whereby you can either replace your house or you can extend it, but the council will no longer entertain, or indeed the policies will support, a replacement dwelling and subsequent extension. Is that, just to be quite clear, it's the same sort of stance you're taking as the one that Guildford has adopted?
So I'm not familiar with the stance that Guildford has taken, but the approach in the plan is very much as I've described it. It's one thing or the other. You can't cumulatively add the two together and get your 50% replacement dwelling where the policy is only talking about 10%. And clearly this goes directly back to the framework where it's talking about what scale of addition, where it's talking about what's not inappropriate within the green belt, and talking about things being materially larger.
So I'm not familiar with the SPD that's been mentioned there, but would that then potentially need to be updated as a result of these policies?
Yeah, so that would be the intention to update supplementary planning documents across the board, where the policies from which they hang have been updated or amended, and certainly we will look at any inconsistency with that previous guidance, but that was certainly not the intention of the 2002 plan to allow that loophole at the time, and I can only imagine that those issues have arisen in the subsequent 20 years. I should say, so that I was involved in writing the original plan, and then I've taken a sabbatical for 20 years, and I've come back to join you at this stage.
So if I may just refer you to one of the lines within the SPD, it says, experience shows that there is often pressure to extend and rebuild at the same time to achieve maximum increase in floor space. While this may be a more efficient and sustainable and financially prudent, the approach is contrary to policies RD2 and RD2A. So I think the SPD is supporting the approach that we are advocating through local plan part 2. But obviously, if there is anything that we can do to strengthen the SPD following the adoption of LPP2, we would be more than happy to make changes.
So in effect, that part of the SPD that you just quoted, that's been imported then into the supporting text of LPP2. Okay, Mr. Chapman.
Sorry, sir, I'm not going to, I'll try not to labour this point, but I would disagree with officers on that matter, and then I can, I'm sure a copy of the SPD can be made available to you. That paragraph, it pertains to being two distinctive elements with regard to looking at a larger property. The first element, you replace your dwelling, and the test for Waverley has always been that the dwelling is habitable, and once the council is satisfied the dwelling is habitable, subsequent extension of up to 40% is then acceptable. Now, I've been practicing in Waverley for a number of years, and ever since I've been working with the borough, that has always been the accepted test and the accepted policy approach that one may replace their dwelling by 10%. Once the dwelling is habitable, the principle of extending it further is acceptable.
Okay, thank you. So got your point on that, Mr. Chapman. Any final points on this particular matter, please, Mr. Longley?
No, sir, other than that, we think our approach is entirely consistent with national policy, and we will clearly look at the SPD and see whether that can be further clarified and updated.
Thank you. And could the SPD be added to the library, please? Okay, so there's no hands up on Zoom and no other points around the table. So if we suggest that we now adjourn. Thank you all for your contributions this morning. We'll resume at 2 o'clock today to discuss matter 4 on settlement boundaries and rural areas. So thank you all.
Thank you, sir.